But now it's time for this.
Order, order. I call Matt Chorley and Tim Shipman.
So it's midday on a Wednesday. It must be PMQs, not the big political event in the House of Commons today. Obviously, we've got Rishi Sunak in half an hour's time, but joined now by Tim Shipman, political editor of the Sunday Times. How are you?
Hi, Matt. Yes, good to be here. It's always strange when PMQs is not the main event of the day, and particularly when you get the sort of autumn statement that we've got here, where the Shadow Chancellor responds. It does mean, though, that if Keir Starmer, as the leader, wants to get his sort of punches in on the economy, on stuff like public sector pay and aid spending and all of that, then he can try and get his soundbite now, and that might supersede his Shadow Chancellor on the 6 o'clock news later.
Yeah, so that's the sort of thing. He needs to get his soundbite out without necessarily knowing what it is he's replying to.
Yeah, I mean, there's a decent amount of it been floating about in the newspapers, but you're sort of going a little bit blind, but really it's about having a few attack lines, and that's what Starmer's not shown himself terribly adept at doing recently. So this is one where he really probably needs to try and get himself a clip.
One interesting thing, having seen what happened last week, it was Boris Johnson on most people's estimations would have said, we've said Boris Johnson had quite a bad week. He lost Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane. He ended up having to self-isolate. There was, allegations of cronyism. There was the row over Priti Patel. And then at the end of the week, the Tories were up in the polls.
Yeah, and Boris Johnson did a pretty decent job of batting off most of what was thrown his way. I have lots of different focus groups, one of which is my mum, who's been pretty rude about Boris when she's been responding to me after these conversations you and I have each Wednesday, and she thought he did better last week. So it'll be interesting to see whether he keeps that up this week.
OK, so Boris Johnson's just replying to a backbench question from Lawrence Robertson, who's a Conservative MP, and then we'll go to find out what the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has got to say. Will he go on coronavirus? Will he go on the economy? Will he try something completely different? I mean, he's not always been the...
I don't know. Just to go back to that story just before the...
Today is International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls. On average, a woman is killed by a man every 3 days in this country. It's a shocking statistic. And sadly, the pandemic has seen a significant increase in domestic abuse. I'll join those marking this day, and I'm sure the whole House would agree we need to do far more to end domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister may remember that in August of last year, he wrote the foreword to the Ministerial Code. It says, and I quote, "There must be no bullying, no harassment, no leaking, no misuse of taxpayers' money, no actual or perceived conflicts of interest." That's 5 promises in 2 sentences. How many of those promises does the Prime Minister think his ministers have kept?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the ministers of this government are working hard and overall doing an outstanding job in delivering the people's priorities, and that's what we will continue to do. And I think if he waits a little bit longer today, he'll hear some of the ways in which this government is going to be taking this country forward with one of the most ambitious programs of investment in infrastructure, in our schools, our hospitals, for generations. And if he wants to make any particular allegations about individual ministers or their conduct, then he's welcome to do so. And the floor is his.
Keir Starmer.
OK, so interesting that Keir Starmer choosing to go back to...
completely off-piste.
Back to last week and Priti Patel.
Yes, absolutely, which, was quite a good sort of area to attack Boris Johnson. He... put Priti Patel out for investigation. It went on for months. He had the report on his desk. He didn't do anything about it. And then months later, we find out that the independent guy who advises on the Ministerial Code found she'd broken it. And Boris Johnson turned around and said, no, she hasn't. And it's a pretty decent stick with which to beat the government about last Thursday. One feels the world's moved on a little bit. I mean, these issues obviously are important and will give him a solid thing which he can use to attack Johnson, but it just, as we were discussing, it just doesn't quite feel where the main event of the day is.
It was striking. While Keir Starmer was asking those questions, Boris Johnson was obviously still isolating, so he's doing it from home in Downing Street, just taking a big drink of water and flicking through his folder in front of him. But then inviting Keir Starmer, if you've got any specific allegations against ministers, he's welcome to raise them. Let's find out.
Bring
if
it
he
on,
takes it up
was what
that
he
offer.
nearly didn't.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't really hear an answer there. So why don't we go through these commitments in turn, starting with bullying and harassment. The now former independent advisor on ministerial standards concluded that the Home Secretary's behaviour was, in his words, in breach of the ministerial code, and he said can be described as bullying, which, Mr. Speaker, means intimidating or insulting behaviour that makes an individual feel uncomfortable, frightened, less respected or put down. What message does the Prime Minister think it sends that the independent advisor on standards has resigned, but the Home Secretary is still in post?
I mean, there's something about his delivery sometimes. This is quite, it's quite a good, juicy sort of issue, and he somehow managed to suck all the life out of it.
He is literally reading out the dictionary, saying, this is what bullying means. I mean, actually, some of that definition about, putting people down and being less respectful, that's exactly what the Leader of the Opposition should be doing to the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's question time. There is nothing Labour MPs would like to see more than Keir Starmer bullying Boris Johnson at this point, and instead he's attacking him with a soft feather duster.
Yes, he is throwing the book at him.
He is literally throwing the open book at him.
Let's go back to Boris Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary, Sir Alex's decisions are entirely a matter for him, but the Home Secretary has apologised for any way in which her conduct fell short. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, I make no apology for sticking up, for standing by a Home Secretary who, as I said just now, is getting on with delivering on the people's priorities, putting already 6,000 of the 20,000 more police out on the street to fight crime, instituting in the teeth of very considerable resistance a new Australian-style points-based immigration system. She's getting on with delivering what I think the people of this country want. She's showing a steely determination, and I think that's probably why his side continue to bash her.
He makes no apology for sticking up for the Home Secretary. Basically, it seems to be as long as you're hiring more police officers, you can be as rude as you'd like to your staff.
Yeah, though the subtext of this is fascinating because privately, Downing Street and Boris Johnson himself don't think she's doing a great job, and there's every chance, I'm told, that she'll be moved in the reshuffle to something sort of more political and less technical, like party chairman.
Do you think that actually this report and this row makes it less likely that she's moved? Because they don't want to look like she's been forced out by the...
I think that's possible, but equally, I was talking to people on Friday and Saturday of last week who still thought it was pretty likely that she would be, and this has certainly been something they've been thinking about for several weeks in Downing Street. I
mean, it should point out that there was Philip Rotnam who ran the Home Office, worked with Priti Patel, resigned, and is I think taking a industrial tribunal against the Home Office. Lots and lots of senior civil servants have gone, but ministers all stay in place.
Yeah, well, Boris Johnson better hope that working with Priti Patel doesn't have cause him to leave at some point. But there is every indication that at some point they will find something slightly less controversial for her to do.
OK, let's go back to Keir Starmer.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that any other Prime Minister would have fired the Home Secretary, and any other Home Secretary would have resigned. So I think we'll chalk that up as one broken porous. On to the next. No leaking. Over the summer, we saw repeated leaks about which areas would go into restrictions. The Prime Minister's plans to go into a second national lockdown were leaked all over the national papers, resulting in a truly chaotic press conference. And we've seen more leaking in the last 24 hours. This serial leaking is causing huge anxiety to millions of people about what's going to happen next. Now, I know there's supposed to be an inquiry underway, but can the Prime Minister tell us, is he any closer to working out who in his government is leaking this vital information?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've already told you that as soon as we have any information about anybody leaking, we'll bring it to the House. But I may say, I think the right honourable gentleman is really concentrating on trivia, when what the people of this country want is to see his support and the support of politicians across the House for the tough measures that we're putting in to defeat coronavirus. He makes various attacks on, I think, on my leadership and the handling of the ministerial code. I take them a lot more seriously, frankly, Mr. Speaker, if the leader of the opposition could explain whether or why the right honourable gentleman, the member for Islington North, is still a member of the Labour Party. Does he support the right honourable member for Islington North continued membership of the Labour Party? Yes or no? Why doesn't he answer that question?
I think I'll just answer the fact that it actually is Prime Minister's questions, not Leader of the Opposition questions. Keir Starmer.
Well, let's just duck in there. Lindsay Hall saying that it's not for Keir Starmer to answer questions about whether or not Jeremy Corbyn, obviously, is the MP for Islington North. He is currently a member of the Labour Party. He's not currently a Labour MP. We should point out. No leaking. Everyone, there's this sort of slight it sort of serves everyone's purposes.
Oh,
leaking.
shoot me now.
I know you're just as bad, constantly publishing leaks.
Well, that's exactly. How dare we go around publishing things? I mean, one man's leak is another man's briefing. This is the problem here. And Keir Starmer briefs in advance about what he's going to be up to, and his people do just the same as people do in the government. I think it's all a bit silly, personally. But what I was struck by at the start of that round of questions was that, having read out the dictionary, Starmer is now inventing new words as well. We had a broken porous, which was a combination of Boris and a broken promise, which could, that could actually catch on. I
heard broken porridge, but that might just be me thinking about breakfast. We should do on this thing of leaking, and Keir Starmer slightly falling into the trap there of suggesting that everything is just briefed out. And because you spend your entire week doing this at the Sunday Times, that what you don't get is a helpful press officer from Number 10 phoning you up and saying, here is everything that's going to happen next week on a plate. Or maybe you do.
No, it's just sort of restraint of trade of journalism. I mean, some things are briefed, where they will tell you this is what the Prime Minister is going to say tomorrow or announce tomorrow. Where things are more than a couple of days away, that almost never happens. What you're doing is phoning your contacts and trying to find out what's going on. Now, some of those are more loose-lipped than others. Some of them have a purpose for telling you what they're telling you. They might be trying to win an internal argument. You need to be aware of who's battling with who, and certainly with this leak, the one he's talking about, the one about the lockdown, it's a claim that the people who wanted the lockdown were the ones putting it out to try and bounce the Prime Minister and win the argument.
And it did, because
they have launched a leak inquiry, and the police have been involved. This is a more serious leak inquiry than some. But governments that pursue leak inquiries get what's coming to them, frankly, because you suddenly find. I mean, David Cameron's government had lots of leak inquiries, and they discovered that David Cameron himself had been blabbing off quite a lot of the time and was the source of most of the leaks from his own government.
And if you want to know more about leaks, you can listen to an episode of the Red Box podcast called The Leak Inquiry, which where we discussed exactly this a couple of weeks ago. Anyway, let's go back to the House of Commons.
Reasonable question, Mr. Speaker.
I think I'll make that decision, Prime Minister. And I think, thankfully, we've got the song. We don't want to lose it. Keir Starmer.
It was your end last time, by the way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The difference, of course, is that I'm tackling the issues in my party. He's running away from the issues in his. And I take it from his answer. I take it from his answer that he's no idea who's leaking from his government. So I think we put that's another one in the no column. Moving on. Perhaps the most serious of the promises under the code: no misuse of taxpayers' money. For weeks, I've raised concern about the government's spraying taxpayers' money on contracts that don't deliver. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is even worse than we thought. This week, a Cabinet Office response suggests that the government purchased not 50 million unusable items of protective equipment, but 180 million. And a new report this morning by the National Audit Office identifies a further set of orders totalling £214 million for face masks for the NHS that it can't use. So will the Prime Minister come clean? How many hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money has been wasted on equipment that can't be used?
This is the sort of greatest hits we're getting. We went around the houses on this.
I think he did this for question 4 last week,
last
didn't
week.
he? But the number's even bigger this week.
It's even bigger than you thought.
And it's still not going to get an answer, I predict.
Well, and I suspect what the Prime Minister will end up saying is that we threw the kitchen sink at everything, and if, essentially if some money was wasted along the way, then so be it. Yeah, but Boris Johnson was getting very, very animated. He's sort of he appears to be standing now at his lectern, his number 10 lectern, which has got covered in papers. And he's getting very animated. And I think he's realised if he keeps shouting on his Zoom link from number 10, he can be heard in the chamber in a way that I'm not sure.
It sounded very bottom of a well again, didn't it? It sounded a bit like a fish drowning in its own water as he was trying to protest. But...
Well, let's go back and see how he does reply to the questions on buying PPE that was unusable.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, actually, 99.5%, to answer his question directly, 99.5% of the PPE, the 32 billion items of PPE that this country has secured, conformed entirely to our clinical needs once we checked it. And I think of all the lines of attack, the pathetic lines of attack that we've heard so far, this is the feeblest, because if you remember, Mr. Speaker, we were faced with a national pandemic that on a scale that we hadn't seen before, and the government was being attacked by the Labour Party for not moving fast enough to secure PPE. I remember the Right Honourable Gentleman saying that we needed to unblock the blockages in the system and that we needed to shift heaven and earth to get it done. That's what he said at the beginning of the pandemic. Then he complained that we moved too slow. Now he's saying that we moved too fast. He's got to make up his mind what his attack is.
Keir Starmer.
Well, it's obvious that either the Prime Minister doesn't know how much taxpayers' money has been wasted, or he doesn't care. So far, Mr. Speaker, that's bullying, harassment, leaking and misuse of taxpayers' money. I must say, Prime Minister, it's not looking good so far, so let's press on. The next one is no actual or perceived conflicts of interest. Where do I start on this one, Mr. Speaker? Last week, we learned that suppliers with political connections were 10 times more likely to be awarded government contracts. This week, the Sunday Times reports that the Health Secretary appointed one of his closest friends to a key advisory role. This friend also is a major shareholder, as it happens, in a firm that specialises in lobbying the government on behalf of its clients, and some of those clients have secured tens of millions of pounds of government contracts during the pandemic. Was the Prime Minister aware of this apparent conflict of interest?
So again, we did cover this at some length last week. Normally, we criticise Keir Starmer for not mounting an argument and not having a sort of train of thought. He is, unfortunately, he's mounting it on the bullet points of the Ministerial Code. So, working his way through bullying, harassment, wasting taxpayers' money, and then the perception of conflict.
Well, there are some redeeming features here that he's quoting a Sunday Times story, but which is obviously very exciting. But really, I'm not sure this is going to trouble the scorers by the time the broadcast media sum up the day.
Right, let's go back and see how Boris Johnson responds this week.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, insofar as there are any conflicts of interest, they will be evident from the publication of all the details of all the contracts. And again, he just seems to be attacking the government for shifting heaven and earth, as we did, to get the medicines, to get the PPE, to get the equipment, to get the treatments that this country needed. And what it reveals really is a deep underlying Labour hatred of the private sector. And it's actually thanks to the private sector and government working with the private sector that the UK was able to produce the world's first usable treatment for the disease in dexamethasone, the world's first, and has worked hard to secure huge numbers of doses of the world's first usable room temperature vaccine. That's the private sector working to deliver for the people of this country. And it's common sense, conservative government working with the private sector rather than abominating them and relying exclusively on some deranged form of state control. How else does he think we could possibly have done it?
Interesting that there is something about Boris Johnson's responses now. They are a bit sharper. It does feel like Number 10 have possibly been sort of workshopping this a bit attacking Labour's deep underlying hatred of the private sector.
Well, everybody gets their own polling and focus grouping, and they all test attack lines about the other side. And Boris Johnson's answers at Prime Minister's questions are as good a guide to what they're getting back from that work as anything else. And, on this, as we've discussed, I think the public probably thinks, 0.5% loss of PPE would probably be regarded as acceptable.
Right, final exchange then. Keir Starmer, is he going to wrap it all up with a bombshell?
Keir Starmer.
No one's knocking the private sector. The government's knocking the taxpayer. And that's not trivial. So, Mr Speaker, I think it's a clean sweep. Bullying, harassment, leaking, wasting public money and obvious conflicts of interest. It's the same old story. One rule for the British public, another for the Prime Minister and his friends. Just look at the contrast between his attitude to spraying public money at contracts that don't deliver and his attitude to pay rises for the key workers who kept the country going during this pandemic. If you've got a hotline to ministers, you get a blank cheque. But if you're on the front line tackling COVID, you're picking up the bill. So will the Prime Minister finally get his priorities right, stop wasting taxpayers' money and give police officers, firefighters, care workers and other key workers the pay rise they so obviously deserve?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's this party and this government that has given key workers, public sector workers, above inflation pay rises this year, as he knows, for police, for the army, for nurses are now getting 12.6% more than they were 3 years ago. And it is this government that will continue to increase the living wage, as he will discover if you just contain his impatience just for a few minutes. Indeed, it's this government that has not only delivered free school meals and fast increase in spending on development around the world, but has looked after the poorest and the neediest. And one of the most important facts about the coronavirus package, the £200 billion package of support that the Chancellor has devised for lives and livelihoods across the country, is that the benefits for overwhelmingly prioritise the poorest and neediest in the country. And the reason we can do that is because we have a government that understands how to run a strong economy and to makes sure that it takes the tough decisions now that will allow our economy to bounce back. And that's what this government is doing.
Well, there was a lot of Build Back Better in all of that. I mean, it was interesting that Keir Starmer tried to sort of tie it all together in the sort of the social media clip that he sometimes lacks. It's one rule for them and one rule from everyone else. That is the sort of thing that resonates.
That is a good attack line for Labour on this government in particular. I thought he might have gone further and tied it all up with a bow and effectively accused the Prime Minister himself of breaching the Ministerial Code in all these ways, because he's effectively shown in all those questions that some of this stuff, transgresses all of those points. But he didn't quite go that far. But yes, he tied it all together. But what he didn't do was try and get any attack lines in on the economy that are likely to make it into the broadcast media later. And it'll all be on his shadow chancellor, who I think most people in the Labour Party think is a fairly low-key individual.
Yeah, and at a time when oppositions, even at the best of times, struggle to get cut through, the shadow chancellors, should be the second most well-known Labour politician in the country, and I don't think even
in a world where only two are actually known.
Exactly.
And at the moment, it's only one.
And if people think of George Osborne to David Cameron or Gordon Brown to Tony Blair, that
even
pairing.
Ed Balls to Ed Miliband was known, and people had a view about him, but it was he was pretty prominent. It's
interesting. There's quite a lot of criticism on social media of those exchanges, saying that given that Keir Starmer put up in lights the things he was going to ask the Prime Minister about, could he have prepared slightly better for the answers? I mean, essentially...
I think that misses the point.
Yes.
From the Prime Minister's point of view, he's not there to provide answers to entertain or enlighten the public. He's there to survive an interrogation. And I think, once again, he just about managed to.
Just as those exchanges wound up, he was asked by Deanna Davidson, who is a Tory MP from Bishop Auckland, wearing a an eye-popping pink suit with pink shirt, I think it's fair to say. Notable because that's not what people normally wear in the House of Commons. She asked about ministerial pay and public sector pay freeze and that sort of thing. And the Prime Minister seems to have committed to freezing ministerial pay as well.
Well, and that's coming from the Red Wall. That's the seats that the Tories were picking up in Labour, old traditional Labour terrain. And they don't like the idea of a bunch of politicians getting a pay rise at a time when Rishi Sunak may be about to make life more difficult for the working man.
Okay, well, that's PMQs Unpacked. Thank you for joining us for that.